Well, it's hard to piece it together because I had to do it as I grew up and talked to my family more about the history. But basically, I was born in Chile and I was born and raised in Santiago. My parents were Korean and they left South Korea. And then my brother and I grew up in Santiago. We went to this really weird international school for like all of our lives. So there were a lot of foreigners coming in and out every 3-4 years. And then I got my training here in the States, all of it in New York. So my first language growing up was Korean until I started school, and then it became Spanish, and that was the primary language I lived in. But it was always Korean at home, Spanish everywhere else. And then as I went to school, it was like all of my education was in English, except Spanish and Chilean history. So then it was this weird balance of 3 languages, day in and day out. When I was growing up and I was in that international school, I mean, it was definitely a bubble. It was a very privileged school, and like a lot of friends, their parents were the ambassadors for different countries or people working for the UN or even international corporations, so there was a lot of privilege and also a lot of mutual understanding in terms of international politics, because we all had to go to school together. I grew up with a lot of awareness of international sort of differences and cultural differences, and it was always a positive thing. It was never it was never a point of contention, and I think that kind of early experience has really helped me embrace a certain sense of diplomacy, that sometimes we as individuals represent not only ourselves, but, whatever community we may be identified with. So you want to do that justice, I was not close to the theater community in Chile, and now there's this resurgence of Chilean theater, which is fascinating, because it's this complete post-dictatorship generation. And I've met, some representative playwrights of that generation, but they're 15, 20 years older than me, Chilean, and, totally embedded in their communities in Santiago. And people will just be like, you're just weird, like how do we make you part of this? I identify as an expat Chilean artist, the way a lot of artists from the 80s became Chilean expat artists. And because I grew up during the regime period, I remember the transition to democracy, but during that time there was such heavy censorship that it was really hard to be outspoken. And people who spoke against what was happening in Chile lived abroad. I'm still part of that disconnected expat artist kind of thing. The way Bolaño, you know what I mean, was like totally embedded in Mexico, but completely writing about Chile. And it was just this thing you did because you couldn't do it back home. And in terms of what I write is, it is a social experiment to live in those kind of conditions, Yeah. So I try to recreate those in my work, and look at topical issues that I think are of relevance, and try to find people that are going to think differently and figure out how it is we can work together. And that is really one of the challenges I like to design into the process. If theater making is kind of a problem-solving practice, what it is that we figure out in the process can be helpful once we're done with the show. And one of my goals is to be able to tour with my work. And the reason why I'd like to tour with it is because I feel like whatever it is we discover in this process may be applicable, or a learned experience that then we can share with different cultures. And one of the reasons why New York is my artistic home is because New York is a microcosm of the world in a way that most other cities aren't. So in certain ways, like New York does have that kind of cultural and creative capital, you know, to be able to do this kind of work. But I do think that the historical context for my work is also kind of really inspired by the experimental work that has happened downtown. I didn't always see where my work would land in terms of space until I began understanding how much a space gives your work context. And that's when I've become a lot more serious about thinking about the histories of all the different venues. And some venues remain, some venues, you know, get gentrified and disappear. So there's always that kind of clash of, well, where's my work happening and what work has happened here before, and what does this mean to do my work here? Growing up in Latin America, all Latin American and I think Central American countries feel like a fraternity, you know? So when we talk about America, we're all inclusive, but America, as in the United States, was always like this separate identity and a separate place. And so when I was growing up, that was always like an issue, you know, like why is this separated and why are we treated differently? My understanding of the Americas is continental, but I do think that an American as in US perspective is not always as inclusive, you know? I think it does create a division that is cultural and political, and it's kind of insane because because when you look at, you know, sort of American history, I mean, even pre-Columbian history is fascinating, you know. Before Europeans came to the Americas, there was already a civilization, you know, two major civilizations and so many histories of people living, even international relations of like, something like the clash of civilizations, you know, like you look at very conservative perspectives looking at Latin America and being like, well, there are like 7 civilizations in the world, but Latin America has none, you know, and you're just like, how did all of this history disappear? As I keep working, I would really love to take my work to different communities and to different countries, because I was able and managed to travel a lot and write in different places. But no matter where I was, no matter what language I learned to speak or what communities I found, they weren't able to read my work all the time. And if I had a show, they might be able to see it. And I think I'd love to keep, you know, that artistic conversation going on with people in different countries through an artistic expression that is more tangible than just writing, which is why I'm also kind of directing my own work. I would like my work to be able to translate into different cultures and different audiences. So when I write, I do consider that. Whether people need some sort of sophisticated lens to understand the nuances of my work is always a question, but I don't feel like I want to strip those away from my work, because I feel that's what gives my work the details and the depth that I feel like it needs to be interesting. I write mostly in English because I was educated in English, so the way I think is primarily in English. I've tried and I've been asked to translate both into Korean and Spanish. I don't know if I want to, you know? Like, I think translating is one thing, adapting is a completely different thing, and I think I could maybe work with someone in a literal translation, but I don't think it's going to have the same impact, you know, unless some writers really adapting that text for a specific either conceptual framework or need in the community, or for an audience that is asking a question. So languages are really funny, right? Like in Spanish, words are gendered, and you can mix things around, pronouns, nouns, articles, you know, like Spanish language is very flexible, you know, and English is very simple in comparison to Spanish language. And then Korean is very structured, you know, and like the grammar is very much, you know, contextual with the verb happening last, right? So when I think about writing and I'm thinking in different languages, sometimes I'm trying to figure out what part of that syntax or language needs to be incorporated into the dialogue, because the way we express ourselves changes, you know, based on that cultural mindset, right? When I wrote Disoriented, I was trying to write about my Korean history, and my matrilineage was actually very important to me. And that matrilineage was something I really wanted to explore in opposition to the patriarchy that we sort of, you know, assume is the norm in Korean culture, you know, and being the first son of my father's family, and you know, like, I mean, like, I always carried that kind of status in my family, and because I'm gay, like, obviously I am totally like fucking up, you know, like my family history, you know, in some way. So I do think gender and cultural norms are something that I question very deeply. It became very clear that the mentality of this family was an immigrant mentality, because my family is an immigrant family, and when we did talkbacks with the audience, we realized very clearly that the way my family, and particularly my parents, preserved their culture got stuck in the 1970s mentality, because they were an immigrant family. I think it speaks to people in different ways, depending on whether they understand the immigrant context of the piece and what generation they are and whether they're American or not. So the immediate response is very, like, it fluctuates so much, you know, but then when you think of the longevity of the piece, like, you want to make sure that what you're writing is gonna be substantiated, you know, and I think that's the part that really excites me about writing it now. Some people consider what I've done an autorial move, you know, to go from writer to writer-director, and some people say, you know, directing is like writing the last draft, and even when you think about making a play, you know, it's like you produce a show and it needs a New York production so that it's even considered with publications, you know, like, I mean, there's this whole industrial baggage, you know, attached to making shows here. But I think for me, it's there's something that is scripted in bodies and in images and through sound, and there's this aesthetic language that then you read on a production that doesn't necessarily get transcribed into a script, you know? And how do you get to write that if you're not directing? I don't know if you can. I really wanted to figure out a way to write these peace messages that weren't agitprop or political messages, you know? Like, how do you do this in a way that's theatrical? And it's a very hard conversation to have, because I feel it's very unique to the fact that I've been asking myself this question and really training and looking for mentors and theatrical models. So it's very much a question deeply imbued in why I'm alive as an artist, you know? And it's a hard thing to then pass on to someone else, you know, as just an artistic project or a collaborative project. I don't feel that resonates as much, you know, once you just give someone a script. And with this piece in particular, like, I kind of realized at one point I'm doing theater with Boal's company in Brazil, when you're devising work based on improvisation and games, based on, you know, engagement with communities, like, your ability to write is like nothing, you know, like, it really is insignificant. So I went from how do you write a play to how do you make theater, you know, and really trying to figure out that question. That question of self-identification, you know, is like a very weird question for me. Like, you know, when you were asking me, like, how are you contextualized? Like, that is always like this question, you know, and like, I find it very stimulating. Like, when I meet with my producers and they're like, how do I market you? Like, that's not interesting, you know, like, I'm like, I don't know, don't talk to me, you know? But like, the context, you know, is very interesting. And because because there's an idea behind it, right? Because there's a question behind it, and there is a discussion to be had. They tell you, write about your experience, write about being Korean, and I'm like, but I'm from Chile, you know, and like that, or like when I was in Korea, they're like, Kyung, we know you're American. And I was like, but I'm from Chile, you know, like there's always that misidentification process, and I like the fact that I can kind of shapeshift a bit, you know, if necessary, to be able to be part of different discussions, you know. And I think some people are only looking at it in terms of economics, but every identity and every history taps into a much deeper community, you know, and every project that I've made has led me into these very unexpected social interactions with different communities in the city. So if people are like, well, you're Korean, I'm like, okay, fine, yes, you know. They're like, you're Latino, I'm like, oh, okay, fine, yes, you know. You're immigrant, I'm like, okay, you're gay, okay, queer, okay, you know, like, I mean, it's, because I think those identity labels kind of tend to separate and discriminate, you know. And because of that, I try not to self-identify in a way that's gonna place me out of something. So as long as it's not a misidentification, I don't care how I'm being contextualized, you know. I feel like as a playwright, like my responsibility is to humanize experience, and because I am so alien, like unless I didn't do this work, my work wouldn't have a certain humanity to it, you know. And the thing I push away is people ask me to take away these details that you talk about so that more people might be able to see it, you know, because people think, oh, if you're too ethnic, people won't relate, or you will not have an audience, or people will not be interested. And actually that is what is most interesting, and that's why people come see my work.